politics is a thing where you can disagree with people really dramatically on policy issues, right? I'm sure you've been in situations even where you're at a family barbecue and you might get into like a big, passionate, heated discussion with somebody in your family about differences in political ideology or on policy. But where we should have agreement on certain things is to keep our democratic foundations solid. I'm working in my Ottawa office today, and I was going through a bunch of things that have happened during this parliament, and it really struck me, I actually had a moment when I looked at it, on how much democracy has been eroded in Canada under Justin Trudeau. And I want to go through these things in a way that if you have somebody who votes Liberal, good for them, but they need to understand that the leader of the Liberal Party right now has actually eroded democratic principles in Canada during his time in office. So, if you think back to the SNC-Lavalin scandal, that's not something that we've talked about recently, but, Trudeau, he allegedly interfered in the judicial process to the point where he removed Jody Wilson-Raybould, his justice minister, because she was standing in his way. And that's a huge problem. Like, the executive branch of government shouldn't be doing that. That there's a reason there's a separation there, right? That's an underpinning of our democracy. So even just in that instance on its own, it was a huge problem. But then you fast forward to this parliament and you see Bill C-10, right? And I'm going to talk about where that's at in a second. But first, for those of you who don't know what Bill C-10 was, it was a huge impingement on your ability to freely speak. It was this bill that would allow the government, and it was put forward by Justin Trudeau, to essentially select what Canadians would or would not see on social media. And again, like there was a huge opposition to that across political stripe, because freedom of speech is a democratic institution in Canada. Justin Trudeau put forward a bill to ensure that that didn't happen. Where is that at? Some of you have asked me. It did pass through the House of Commons with the support of the Bloc Québécois. In Canada, a bill, in order for it to become law, has to pass both the House of Commons and the Senate. It's stalled in the Senate right now. The Senate isn't sitting. Many people are expecting Justin Trudeau to call an election this summer. If there is an election, it falls off the order paper because Parliament is dissolved. So it's sort of in no man's land right now. But Justin Trudeau is proposing this a huge incursion on freedom of speech. So there's another way that democracy has been eroded in Canada under him. Then we now have, I encourage you to watch the video on my feed on this, Justin Trudeau, the government, is suing the Speaker of the House of Commons because they're defying an order of Parliament. Parliament is supreme. Those of you who've been following this, you know that Parliament, we're in a minority Parliament situation, so all the opposition parties got together to compel the Trudeau Liberal government to produce documents surrounding an incident where the samples of the Ebola virus were removed from a Canadian lab and potentially taken to China. Parliament has the right to compel those documents. The Trudeau government has not complied with it. They were found in contempt of Parliament around this. And now, instead of complying with Parliament, they're taking the Speaker of the House of Commons to court. This is a huge erosion of democracy in Canada. Think about that. Think about that for a second. The executive branch of government is telling the legislative branch of government that it's not going to comply with it. That's something that happens in countries that are not democracies, yet it's happening here in Canada under Justin Trudeau. There's a lot of other things that concern me as well too. So for example, during the middle of the pandemic, when Parliament wasn't sitting, the government put in place what we call an order in council in order to confiscate legally owned property, and that is firearms. Now, regardless of where you sit on the firearms debate in Canada, you should, if you support democratic principles, that's something that should have come to debate in the House of Commons. It shouldn't have just been executed by the government. That's really concerning, right? I mean, think about this. Like, obviously firearms, it's a charged issue for many people, but the government shouldn't be confiscating any type of property without parliamentary debate to that extent, right? So there's another example of how Justin Trudeau is just, sort of saying, well, I don't have to abide by democratic principles in Canada. It's a huge problem. And the other thing that still concerns me is that we don't have any plan to reopen Canada's borders. Many Canadians have, gotten a vaccine. Our case numbers have dropped across the country. And rather than look at ways to identify and detect pathogens, right, which the government didn't do in the case of COVID-19. You'll remember them saying that the risk to Canada was low. They refused to close the border, but our borders are still closed without any sort of plan or transparency or timeline on how that is going to reopen. And that's something, again, that free movement is something that Canadians, it's part of our democratic principle. And of course, we want to ensure that Canadians are safe, that they're healthy, that we're responding to a pandemic. But now, like, where's the plan? Why aren't they dealing with that? Especially when we have better science and evidence. It's a sort of, I think, lack of regard for Canadian democratic principles. The other thing is our military. I mean, a strong democracy should have a robust military in order to protect the sovereignty of our country. And, Trudeau has turned a blind eye to, sexual harassment allegations, rampant sexual harassment and harassment allegations in the Canadian military. Arguably, his defense minister has lost the confidence of Canadians. Many senior officials have been removed or put on leave, and there's allegations that the defense minister knew about this but did nothing. And he's just like, yeah, whatever, I'm just going to stand by this guy. I mean, how is that protecting Canadian democracy or Canadian sovereignty when he can't even figure out how to get this right and protect the rights of women in the Canadian military? And it's not just the documents that I talked about in the House of Commons, where he's suing the Parliament. Many of you watched me over the last year in the Health Committee, and you saw how he refused, like the government would filibuster, or they just refused to comply with orders. For example, vaccine contracts. You guys paid billions upon billions of dollars. I don't know how much you paid. There's this whole basic principle of democracy that you shouldn't have taxation without representation. And as I was trying to find out, whether or not we got value for money on those contracts, whether or not, because we didn't have vaccines when other parts of the world did. Many of you watched the United States have access to that tool in January and February of this year. We didn't get it till much later. That cost businesses closing their doors, and yet I couldn't, as your representative, as representative of my riding, as the opposition member responsible for these types of issues, I couldn't look at these documents, even though our committee had compelled them. Parliament compelled them, right? So again, just completely ignoring democratic principles. And then, I'm hearing things about, Bill C-36, some potential issues, significant issues in there. I'm actually just reviewing that bill today. Again, like, what we see over and over and over again from Trudeau is this lack of regard for Canadian democracy to an extent that's never been seen in any government. So even if you don't vote Conservative and you don't agree with policy, you should be concerned about this erosion of democratic principle. You don't want somebody leading the country who just really doesn't care about Parliament, about sexual assault allegations in the Canadian military. These are all things that we need in order, or free speech. These are all things that we need in order to ensure a vibrant democracy so that we can disagree about policy. I'm really worried about our country right now under Trudeau, and you're going to see a lot of him, over the next month, as every pundit here in Ottawa is talking about how Trudeau is going to call an election. So he looks like he's in campaign mode, and he's hoping that he's going to be able to fool a lot of Canadians with looks. I think we have to look at his record as well, too, with regard to protecting Canada's democracy. And he's arguably eroded a lot of those freedoms during his time in government. And that's regardless of how you vote, you should be concerned about that, and you should be holding them to account. Every Canadian should be. What have I done in this regard? You guys know that every day I am fighting in the House of Commons. When we sit, I use every legislative tool at my disposal to fight these issues. But those tools only work if the Canadian public demands that the government upholds them, right? And if they don't, that they deal with that at the ballot box. So anyway, I'm going to keep going through a bunch of work today here in Ottawa, and then get back to Calgary as soon as possible. But I want you to share this video. If you know somebody who, is like, I kind of like Trudeau. If they care about democracy in Canada, they should be caring about these issues. I could have talked about how he tokenizes people as opposed to, actually affects change, but that's a subject of another video. So share this video, and just know that Trudeau should be held to account for eroding democracy in Canada. Working hard for you in Ottawa. Have a great day.